Hello, I'm Ronnie Eldridge. Welcome to Eldridge and Company. I'd like to talk today about the more than 600,000 people who are released from our country's prisons every year and the reasons too many of them eventually return. Bruce Western, professor of sociology and co-director of the Justice Lab at Columbia University, has written about this in his new book, Homeward, Life in the Year After Prison. And he's my guest today. Welcome.
Thanks for having me, Ronnie.
Thank you. The problem's overwhelming, and at the end you say that we really can't have criminal justice without social justice. And this is the book that really shows us why that's true, right?
So when we talk about prisons in America and we talk about crime in America, the inescapable realities for me are racial inequality and poverty. And I spent a lot of time talking to people who were coming out of prison, and I came to understand just the formidable challenges they'd faced, not just coming out of prison, but over their entire lives. And I think until we come to grips with the very harsh conditions of poverty in America and very deep racial inequalities in which people feel they don't have a stake in the mainstream structure of opportunities in American society, until we grapple with those problems, then I can't see how we find a way out of the crisis of mass incarceration.
What percentage of people coming out or in prison, we know the race question, but what's the economic level?
The average level of schooling of people in state prison is about 10 and a half years. The average reading level is at about a 6th or 7th grade level. And so that means that the economic opportunities of people who are in the prison system are incredibly poor. And of the people that we were interviewing in Boston, most 90% grew up in low-income families, and they grew up in neighborhoods that were also very poor, in which opportunities were extremely limited.
So in Boston, when you were at Harvard, you did a study called the Boston Reentry study, right?
Right.
And you interviewed a lot of people in the state prison. How many facilities are there in Boston that are?
So in the Massachusetts prison system, there are 18 facilities. It's not a huge system by national standards, small state, and New England is a low incarceration area. So there are about 10,000 people in prison in Massachusetts. We talked to 122. We went into nearly every prison in the entire system. Oh. So we're going into the state mental hospital, we're going into solitary confinement units, non-contact units, interviewing people behind plexiglass a week before they were released.
So somebody's really in solitary confinement before he's released, or she?
Yeah, we talked to a number of people who released from solitary confinement, and that means they're in a cell and they're locked down for 23 hours every day, and they come out for an hour rec time or they go out for a shower, and they're released from those conditions directly to the street.
Have they maxed out, or are they on parole?
Some of both. Some people, at the time we were running the study, not a lot of people were released to parole, but they were released to probation. And some people had wrapped up their sentences and they were coming out and they were under no supervision, and they were essentially on their own.
So you followed 122 people and they all landed up in Boston?
And so the only criteria for eligibility for the study was that you were returning to a neighborhood in the Boston area. And so this meant we interviewed men, we interviewed women, we interviewed very young people, some as young as 18 and 19, and some very old people in their 50s, 60s. I think our oldest respondent was in his late 60s.
And you saw them before they came out of prison, a week after they came out of prison?
That's right.
Then a couple of months later, and then you followed them for how many years?
We followed them for 1 year.
1 year.
And so we interviewed them 4 times after they got out of prison. And we're really interested in what happens in this period immediately after you come out. So we talk to them a week after they're released back in the community, which in itself was kind of miraculous to see the transformation in someone. You talk to them 2 weeks earlier and they're inside an institution, and 2 weeks later they're in street clothes and in the community, and then we followed them over.
And were they overjoyed, or were they nervous, anxiety? I mean,
a bit of both. So our icebreaker question in the interview is, what's the best part about being out? That was the first question we asked in our first community interview. And the two most common responses were family and freedom. They were the words that people said most frequently when they got out. But a lot of people were very anxious and experienced a lot of anxiety, particularly in the first few weeks. The crowds were unfamiliar. They didn't like riding mass transit. A lot of people didn't like spending time in public places, so they spent a lot of time at home if they had a household to stay in, or in a shelter if they're in that sort of setting.
so what happens? I mean, why do they go back? Is it because they're just not prepared for it? Right? I mean, it's a whole system. It's very hard to say where you start.
Yeah.
When you start talking, it seems to me it starts in school, or it starts at home. We know that. And if you're living in a poor family, in a family way below poverty level, where people aren't working, where there's addiction and violence, which happens in a lot of families with the stress, right?
Yeah.
And you go to school and you don't behave and you get expelled, so you're on the street.
Yeah.
So then the next progression is drugs or something, and then you're in jail, in prison.
So that's
such a dismal kind of thing.
That's very much the trajectory we were seeing. And I think one of the interesting things that we learned about the study, and maybe this will sound obvious in retrospect, was the exposure to serious violence and trauma that people had early in childhood. And so many of the respondents that we interviewed grew up in very chaotic homes, and there was often family violence in the home. 40% of the people we interviewed had witnessed someone being killed in childhood. And so people were growing up with a lot of violence in their lives, and they'd been exposed to violence, they'd been victimized by violence as kids. School discipline problems were very, very common, and a lot of people stopped going to school at very young ages, and then quite a few were in the juvenile justice system and had been detained as kids, and so there's a whole trajectory that leads up to going to state prison, and in criminal justice, people often talk about the front door of the system and the back door, and prison admission is the front door, and discharge at the end is the back door. But I think in a lot of cases, we were sort of seeing a revolving door. People were cycling in and out of different institutional settings, sometimes prison, sometimes jail, sometimes detox, sometimes hospitals and emergency rooms. And so they were very much living on the edge.
If a child is born in a more affluent environment, if they aren't doing well in school, then a parent is likely to seek help, right?
Yeah.
And then the child is tested, and you learn they have a learning disability, and then you do that, and then you go through school. But poor people who can't avail these services never know. So, I mean, have we ever tested people in prison as to learning disabilities?
We know that the reading level of a lot of people in prison is very low. I don't think we've tested systematically. It's funny, right? At prison admission, we screen for infectious disease, and there are risk assessments and so on. but testing for basic literacy, and for which the policy response would be education in prison. I think that's an area in which we could invest significantly and see really significant returns.
Right. It's interesting. I mean, what happens in prison when people, and also these people who are in prison and coming out, who have such a low ability and no high school diploma or whatever and can't find jobs, could have maximized and improved that so much in prison. So do different states, I guess, have different levels of programming and interest in doing that?
Yeah, and though I think the general story in over the last 4 decades, in the period in which prison populations were increasing a lot, prison programming shrunk a lot, and so educational opportunities in prison are much worse, than they were historically. And I should say, we talked to a lot of people who were smart and creative and energetic and had tremendous capacity if they were given the right kind of support and opportunity. But it was just as you described it, they would run into trouble at school. They would have disciplinary problems as adolescents. And all of the support that gets poured into kids in middle-class schools and middle-class families, that was missing for them. And so there are lots of talented, capable people who are passing through our criminal justice system for whom investment could really pay off, I think.
Do you think this is all because the basic sentiment in this country has been tough on crime, put people away, keep them away, right? Long terms, keep them away. And it's vengeance, really. And instead of saying this is a problem, a social problem, and using this time that somebody is in prison to really try to change it. So,
and so, prison populations have been growing in America for about 40 years now. And just over the last 10 years, the incarceration rate has ticked down a little bit. So something new is happening in the policy conversation. But over this period in which prisons were growing, tough on crime politics was the dominant way of talking about and responding to a whole variety of social problems in really poor communities, not just crime, but untreated addiction, homelessness, mental illness. And I think you're exactly right. It reflected a very vengeful posture on the part of elected officials. And in a way, the book is kind of an effort to create a different kind of conversation, to try and humanize and elevate the voices of people who are passing through the system, and try and make a case for why we should view people in the criminal justice system with compassion and take account of their humanity. And so that is, I think that's kind of the effort in the book, to start a different kind of conversation.
It definitely is. It's overwhelming almost when you think about the conversation. It's a lost opportunity. Instead of saying we're always going to put people in prison, this is an opportunity to really offer the services and care that would bring. I mean, you immediately strip somebody's dignity the minute they're in the system, right?
I think the prison is such an unusual institution, and most people have no exposure to prisons in their daily lives. And incarceration rate in the United States, 700 per 100,000. So only 0.7% of the entire population of the country are in prison at any one time, but that's overwhelmingly concentrated in disadvantaged communities of colour. So people in those communities understand what the criminal justice system looks like, but outside, we have no idea. And I think our vengefulness, our resort to prison as a solution for social problems would be moderated if we understood what conditions were like in those institutions, what it was like to be locked down for 23 hours.
If we could only, everybody could spend I don't know. I'm not going to recommend that, but anyway.
I think we could open up the institutions, make them more transparent, make the conditions more transparent. There's a prison strike going on right now.
That's so interesting, isn't it?
And we don't know. And
Yeah.
I think partly the effort of the strike is to gain national attention for the conditions inside penal institutions.
Definitely. And also, it touches on the economic injustice, because they're saying if they do have a job in prison, either do they always have to get paid? If it's just they can be paid 5 cents but they're really forced labor.
It's a really hard problem, and for me it's a complicated issue. People in prison should be paid at a level commensurate with a free society. The best employment programs that we saw in Massachusetts were work furlough programs, where people were leaving the institution in the daytime and working in jobs in the open labour market. And they were incredibly successful for allowing people to get job skills, accumulate savings, and have continuity of employment when they're released.
They went back to the state prison at the end of the day?
That's right. That's right. And they were working...
We don't do that in New York. We have to go to a halfway house or... Yeah.
And work furlough programs used to be much more common, and they became viewed as risky, and as the institutions became more closed, those programs were lost. But there are still work furlough programs in Massachusetts, and I thought they were tremendously successful.
I thought one of the points of irony was that there were some prisoners who were fighting the fires out west.
Yeah.
Next to regular firefighters, but what they were getting paid was the total. What were they getting paid? $1 a day or something?
Yeah.
I don't remember. So it was incredible. The other part that's ironic and so typical of the system is, I don't know if this is nationwide, but your prisoners who came out, you released your people back out, had to pay the parole officer and probation.
Yeah.
They had to pay these people to
So this is very common, paying parole and probation fees.
It's ridiculous, because they come out, they don't have a job.
Median income in our sample was $6,000 a year. That's half the federal poverty line. And they had to pay probation and parole fees. And if they couldn't pay the fees, their families would often pay it for them. And it serves no criminal justice purpose, fines and fees. It is literally the criminalisation of poverty and the penalisation of poverty. And I think Massachusetts in many ways is a best case scenario. The whole problem with fines and fees that we saw is just the tip of the iceberg. In other parts of the country, we have a study in Oklahoma at the moment. People going through misdemeanor court, very poor people, often struggling with drug problems. They pay court fees. They pay a DA's fees, so they pay for their own prosecution. They pay jail fees, so they're paying for their own incarceration. And that's because the tax bases have shrunk, anti-tax sentiment.
And they go to local communities.
Yeah. Yeah.
We know that the relationship between a person incarcerated and the family is a very important thing to try to encourage and maintain.
Yeah.
But it's a very costly thing to call home.
Yeah, and so people are charged a lot to use their phones, and often those costs fall on the family because they're putting money on the commissary account so people can call. And I think where I landed with the book is I think we have to think about criminal justice in a socially integrative way, and that means that people who have caused harm to others and people who have been victimised, as a matter of public policy, we need to figure out how to draw people back into the social compact, how to make them productive members of our community again. And all of these things, fines and fees, exorbitant rates for phone calls, they have the reverse effect. They exclude people. They push people out of the social compact. And I think we need to think very hard as a matter of correctional policy and penal policy. Is this drawing someone back into society? Is it preparing for them a place in the community in which they can become a productive person? Or is it excluding them? Is it making them an outcast? And if it is making them outcast, I think it's totally self-defeating as a strategy for community health and public safety. And so social integration, I think, is the key.
So how do we go about doing that?
I think as a matter of policy, I think there are 10 things we could do tomorrow that would make a real difference, and they're probably focused in the areas of housing, health, income. The big question is political. It's not about policy, I don't think. How do we create a set of political conditions that can press change? And I think fundamentally it is about changing the narrative, changing the culture around how we talk and think about violence and other crime, particularly in very disadvantaged communities.
Are you interested in politics?
I would love to be doing work, research, which is my skill set, that could move the political and policy conversation in a productive direction.
So what are the opportunities to connect to those people who do this?
I think we're entering a new
more
kind of
optimistic.
era.
Yeah.
And for 20 years, the first 20 years in my career, every year the news was always bad. Prison populations were always growing, more people under supervision. And over the last few years, it's been different. The most promising thing I see, or one of the most promising things I see, is a left-right consensus. There are people on the conservative side of politics, and there are people on the progressive side of politics who believe the system has to change. It's not working. I'm tremendously encouraged by the political voice and activism of people who have been involved in the system and who are formerly incarcerated and justice involved, because I think the system is very disempowering. And if people are getting organised and their voices are being elevated, there's so much moral urgency there, and there's so much humanity there. I think that can also be a very important.
True. What was troubling at the beginning, but it's very good because the way you're pulling it together, is on the more conservative people saw the inefficiency financially.
As a government program run amok.
Right,
Yeah.
And then we have to bring the humanity into it.
I think there's a real openness to that on the conservative side of politics too. I think conservative Christians have been talking about criminal justice reform in terms of values of redemption and second chances. And so, this really is an issue that liberals and conservatives can come together over.
So it is a question of the basic social democracy that we really want to see, right?
Yeah.
We don't want to see this enormous disparity of income and an enormous disparity of opportunity.
No.
We can't live this way.
And I think criminal justice reform is a way of expanding opportunity and making society fairer.
Breaking it up, I think.
Yeah.
It's so obvious what the problems are.
Yeah.
It is. Have you been to Europe and looked at those other things? It's ironic, isn't it, that Germany comes up with a humanistic approach? Yeah. I mean, I think the experience of war casts a large shadow over Europe, and there is a deep concern culturally, politically, over the authoritarian power of states.
And so the whole correctional project, the whole prison project in Europe is much more rehabilitative. I went to a remarkable meeting in Scotland over the summer where the Scottish Prisons Commissioner was saying our prisons have to be instruments of social justice, they have to expand opportunity, and they have to build community membership among people that are incarcerated. And it was very important for the Scottish policy makers to be a progressive beacon in the world. It was a very different political conversation about prisons there.
So encouraging. So maybe in response to the current administration, we will find the same kind of movement in this country.
It's possible, and there are voices within the administration too that are interested in criminal justice reform. We should welcome those.
People should read this book so they understand more graphically what happens to somebody. Thank you so much, Bruce
Thanks
Weber.
so much, Ronnie.